You've heard me talk many times over the last couple of years, ever since I sat down and did the math on this and just, went back and looked at the reporting and just started lining up. I mean, I lived through it, right? You and I lived through the pandemic. And early on, in fact, the last week of April, Louise and I joined two of my brothers and several of their kids and all three of our kids on a cruise, a Caribbean cruise. It was just a family vacation. It was not a big deal. And we went out of Galveston, in fact. I guess it went to Mexico or something. I don't even recall. It was nice. It was a nice little cruise. But when we came back, we were all sick. And a lot of the people on the ship were sick. And that was the first week of April. That was, the very end of March of 2020. And when we got home, we discovered that an entire cruise ship was full of COVID people that was being held at port in Japan. And I don't know if we had COVID or not. I don't think we did, but we got something. But that was the week that basically all hell broke loose here in the United States. And when I put the math together on this and looked at what happened, some real interesting numbers came out. March was when Trump first shut the country down. And at least much of the country. I mean, this was the beginning. And on April 7th and April 8th, those were the dates that the New York Times, and I include actually the screen capture of the New York Times front page from April 8th, 2020, in my article today over at HartmannReport.com. And you don't have to subscribe or pay or anything to see it. You just go to HartmannReport.com and click on it and you can read it. And because, some people have said, well, really? Was this the thing that influenced Trump, really? And the headline is, Black Americans bear the brunt as deaths climb. Now, keep in mind, Trump had just shut down the country, a couple weeks earlier. And the Dow had collapsed, and he was looking at, a stock market collapse and an economic crisis here in the United States as a result of shutting the country down. And this is an election year. I mean, he's 8 months out from the election and freaking out about it. And suddenly the New York Times comes along, and there were similar headlines on the front page of the Washington Post, and it led the news on all the major networks, all the minor networks, all the cable networks, everywhere. That, hey, it's mostly black people dying. And that afternoon, April 8th, Rush Limbaugh comes out and says, I've been waiting for the racial component with the coronavirus. The coronavirus now hits African Americans harder than illegal aliens, harder than women. It hits African Americans harder than anybody. Disproportionate representation. And I mean, it doesn't take a medical savant to figure out why African Americans die at a higher rate of pretty much everything in America because of 400 years of institutional racism and discrimination and basically enforced poverty, which leads to poor health outcomes. But the other part of this is that frontline workers, the so-called essential workers, also tend to be heavily African American and Hispanic. The people who are driving buses, the people who are picking crops, the people who are working in stores and supermarkets, the frontline low-wage workers. And so when this news came out, Tucker Carlson said on Fox News, and Tucker was the only guy who had been taking COVID seriously at that point. But this is April 8th. He said, we can begin to consider now how to improve the lives of the rest. In other words, the white people who aren't dying of COVID. He says, the countless Americans who've been grievously hurt by this, by our response to this, how do we get 17 million of our most vulnerable citizens back to work? In other words, how do we get those black people and Hispanic people back into the workplace to get this economy back on track so Donald Trump can get reelected? And he went on about that. I mean, most white workers, particularly, the vast majority of salary workers are white, and they were working from home. And a lot of even hourly workers were working from home, but it was mostly salaried workers. Britt Hume goes on Fox and says, the disease turned out not to be quite as dangerous as we thought. And what he left off there was at the very end to white people. So now we know that, and on April 12th, Trump tweeted out a call to fire Anthony Fauci, and pretty soon, and then FreedomWorks on April 13th said, we got to open the country. All the right-wing billionaires, the white right-wing billionaires, got in on this. April 19th, you had Reopen America, or Open the Country rallies in Oregon, Arizona, Delaware, North Carolina, Virginia, Illinois, New Hampshire. One of the biggest ones was in Michigan, where they showed up with Nazi flags, swastikas, Confederate flags, and assault rifles to intimidate Gretchen Whitmer, who had shut down the state. So what happened in April when this news came out? Well, the Trump administration scrapped their plan to send masks to everybody in America through the post office. Trump put into place the Emergency Production Act. The name is somewhat like that. That forced workers in meatpacking plants, predominantly brown and black people in meatpacking plants, to go back to work, even though he wouldn't, the Defense Production Act it's called, even though he wouldn't use the Defense Production Act to force the production of personal protective equipment or even COVID tests. And then we learned, and it took us almost a year to learn this because it took a while to interview these people, but this was an expert member of Jared Kushner's team. Trump had put Kushner in charge of the response, who said the political folks believed it was going to be relegated to Democratic states, that they could blame those governors, and that would be an effective political strategy. So Jared Kushner and Donald Trump believed that because most of the deaths were happening in Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Washington State, all blue states, that they could blame this on blue state governors, and because most of the people who were dying were black and brown, they could just put the country back to work. Yeah, there'll be a few white people who die, but they're people who aren't healthy anyway, right? They're elderly or they're obese or whatever, and so let's just go for it. Getting reelected is more important than protecting the country, and as a result of this conscious decision, this effective political strategy. Jane Mayer wrote for The New Yorker, for example. This was about Joe Kennedy Jr. Max Kennedy Jr. He's 26 years old. He was one of Kushner's guys. And she writes, Kennedy was disgusted to see that the political appointees supervising him were hailing Trump as a marketing genius, because Kennedy said they'd told him he personally came up with the strategy of blaming the blue states. So, Deborah Birx, who was, one of Trump's COVID advisors, has come out and said that at least 200,000 people died because Trump tried to reopen the country in order to get himself reelected. This was all about the 2020 election. This was an election year. The Lancet, the British journal, has said 500,000 Americans died unnecessarily. We have the worst COVID death rate in the world, or at least in the developed world. There are a few countries that are worse than us, but by and large, we had the worst COVID death rate in the world, and certainly in the developed world, period. And why? Because Donald Trump and Jared Kushner thought it would be a, quote, effective political strategy, end quote, to force black and brown people back to work with the Defense Production Act and social pressure, and blame blue state governors. If this isn't genocide, racially based genocide, I don't know what is. And I'm wondering where Jack Smith is on this. And this is the last sentence of my article was, Jack Smith, are you listening? Because this is a slaughter. 500,000 Americans didn't need to die. Had we had the same death rate as Australia, we would have had about 20% as many deaths as we had. Maybe 25%. Because they took it seriously. And Trump wanted to get people back to work because he was afraid a bad economy would cause him to lose the election, which, by the way, was an accurate fear. So what do we do about this? How do we prosecute this guy?